Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We are just waiting as the participants all enter now that we've been able to turn it live. Just for a little bit of color and excitement, we did lose power and internet at the winery just 5 minutes before starting this, so that's why we're a little delayed. But we're very, very excited that it returned so that we're able to present, or else it was going to be all up to Jim. And we just know that as our founder and CEO, he would not be able to talk about this wine that he created on his own. Just teasing. But wonderful. It's so we're so thankful to have you all join us and to tune in. I am the winery director here at Willamette Valley Vineyards. My name is Christine Clair, and today you're joined by our founder and CEO, Jim Bernau, along with our head winemaker, Joe Ibrahim, and our winery chef, DJ MacIntyre. And really, we're here today because Whole Cluster is really one of the first reds to be released each vintage. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to really celebrate the release of this wine and then kind of unfold really what went into making this wine, since 2020 was a challenging year in many facets of our lives, but including the harvest conditions that we went through here in the Willamette Valley. And so we wanted that opportunity to kind of share how this wine came to be. And so we're going to hear from Jim on the creation of this wine back when he was experimenting in the early days of the winery. We're then going to hear from Joe about the 2020 growing season and the conditions that they faced during harvest and how we were able to navigate those conditions. And then hear from our chef about the best ways to serve and enjoy our Whole Cluster Pinot Noir with some of his signature dishes. But before we get going and launching in, I do want to make sure to invite you to be asking questions throughout the presentation today. We have our marketing manager, Mandy Morgan, who is going to be answering live the questions that you have. And then we will also be addressing some of the questions that might benefit the whole group from hearing at the end of the presentation. So please don't be shy. We're excited to tackle those questions and to fill them in. But let's see, I want to invite Jim to really set the stage on this bottling here and how Whole Cluster really became Whole Cluster.
Christine, it is wonderful to have all of these folks online to hear the origin story about Whole Cluster Pinot Noir. Back in 1991, when we were really just a few years into making wine at Willamette Valley Vineyards, we thought, we love Pinot Noir, and we experimented in how we were fermenting and making Pinot Noir. And one of the techniques that we tried was a technique that the French were using in making their Gamay Noir, using a method called carbonic maceration in making their Cru Beaujolais. And so what we did was we wanted to do something that actually wasn't done really at that time. And that was we opened the rollers on the destemmer. And those rollers, well, when the berries are destemmed from the cluster, they fall between these two rollers, and the rollers split the berries before they go into the fermenter. And what we did was we opened those rollers wide open so that the whole berry would drop into the fermenter. The second thing we did was we added, ripe stemmed whole clusters of perfectly formed fruit into the fermenter as well as whole clusters. And what happened was the juice fermented into wine by inside each berry, so that each berry was a fermenter, and it pulled the color and flavors from inside the skin, and then the berries would swell up. And so if you came to the winery with me, let's say in late September, early October, we could open up the fermenter and we could pull out one of those clusters, and most of the berries will have been burst, but there'll still be some that are swollen, and they'll be pink. They won't be black, right? Because the color's been extracted from inside, and they'll be swollen. You could put one of those berries up into your mouth and just give that stem a tug, and it will explode in your mouth. And it tastes like Pinot Noir candy. And so we thought, oh my gosh, we're going to have to make a wine out of in this approach. And we did. We made a small amount of this wine. And that was the year that Bob Parker, who at that time, the industry was very young and small. And so when he wrote for the Wine Advocate, for his own Wine Advocate, Robert Parker's Wine Advocate, he would drive around to the wineries to do his tastings. And he gave us just a tremendous write-up. And I think that you might be able to see it on your screen. And there it is. You can see this wonderful write-up that he gave us. And he said, it may be the world's most delicious and accessible Pinot Noir. So as a young winemaker, you can imagine what that did for Willamette Valley Vineyards. And so over the years, we originally called it many years ago, Whole Berry Pinot Noir, but then we changed the name to Whole Cluster because we added more whole clusters as the weather warmed and we had more ripe and more lignified stems. And in fact, we've been doing this so long that the Federal Trademark Office gave us a trademark for the term whole cluster to be used on wine. You know, the other thing that that I wanted to share with you about this wine is, and some of you might remember this, back in 1991, 60 Minutes did a broadcast. And it was a small segment of their 60-minute broadcast. And it was called The French Paradox. And what 60 Minutes wanted to find out is how do the French have the lowest level of cardiovascular disease in the industrialized world? And yet, you know, they eat all these fatty foods, they smoke like chimneys, and they party all night. How is that possible? So they sent their cameras to France to try and figure out what's going on. And they came back with this story they broadcast in 1991 called The French Paradox. And the conclusion that they reached was, it's gotta be the red wine. Well, there's a professor at Cornell University who got this information from the French, but he asked this question. He asked a follow-up question. He said, are all red wines equal? And he did a study to find out, you know, amongst the red wines, you know, which is the most favorable in terms of their cardiovascular benefit. And he discovered it was Pinot Noir. And so I sent him Pinot Noirs to be tested, and he found the whole cluster fermented Pinot Noir to be the highest in its test results for resveratrol, which is that powerful ingredient in wine that benefits your cardiovascular system. And what it does is it's a very small molecular structure, and you might be able to see the results, the lab results here on this next slide, where you can see the lab results that measures how much resveratrol is in this wine, and it says 7 micromoles. Well, that's 2 to 3 times, generally 3 times the content of resveratrol in, let's say, a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Merlot. And the reason for that is that Pinot Noir that's grown in a moist, cool climate, what it does is it develops a natural defense against botrytis. It's trying to protect its fruit, and botrytis, of course, can break the skins and spoil the fruit. And so Pinot Noir vine is pumping the skins of Pinot Noir full of resveratrol, because resveratrol is the defense against botrytis. And so what we did is we went to the federal government and we said, we really should be able to put this on our label. And as you might recall, the federal government takes a very dim view of saying anything positive about alcohol on a label. And we were the very first winery in the world where the TTB authorized us, and you might be able to see this label here. You can look at the back label of our whole cluster Pinot Noir, and you can see on this label the resveratrol content that's listed and a statement that explains where resveratrol comes from. And we even got to use the A word. We got to describe resveratrol as an antioxidant on the label. So anyway, those are just a few stories about this wine, and it's a little bit about its history. And you're going to hear now from other members of the winery team in learning more of recent updates about this wine.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I was thinking back when you were talking that one of the real secrets to whole cluster is really how it's evolved over its time here in Oregon and with the warming conditions, but also the quality and talent we have here in our cellar. And our head winemaker, Joe Ibrahim, he joined us back in 2016, and he really embraced, you know, fine-tuning this craft of whole cluster and whole berry fermentation. And to that point, it's really been recognized within, you know, wine reviewers. And so here we have our history of success, and you can see Whole Cluster Pinot Noir and its sister wine, the Whole Cluster Rosé, have received 90+ point scores for a, you know, it's even back since 2017. We just could only fit so many on this slide to share, but a lot of that really has to do with Joe and how the quality he puts into the vineyard, the management of the fruit and the farming, but also the winemaking. And so he's been able to receive 90+ scores on all of our nationally distributed wines for the past 3 vintages, which is a real feat when you think about all the wines that we make here. And the other thing about Joe, before he gets to share more about the vintage, is he's just the coolest, calmest, most collected winemaker. So even with really stressful harvests like 2017 and 2020, it's like nothing phases him. And it's pretty incredible to have that type of presence here. So Joe, I would love to hear about kind of the vintage and, you know, what you did in the cellar.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks, Jim, for the intro. It's a real pleasure to join you guys today to talk about the Whole Cluster Pinot Noir. It's one of our favorite wines to produce. It's a really unique wine. Jim touched on it. We use a mixture of whole cluster fermentation, carbonic maceration, and on certain vintages like 2020, we utilize whole berry fermentation as well. And, you know, the magic of whole cluster fermentation is really, as Jim alluded to, it's conducting the fermentation within the berry itself. It's a really gentle form of extraction when you're making wine. You know, Jim talked about how you can add the rollers or take off the rollers when you're crushing the fruit. By leaving the berry intact, you allow the fermentation to take place within the berry. And the resulting wine that you get, and I think we have a picture showing how it looks in the fermenter and then how it comes out when it's done, produces a really, there's a great picture. There's Grant right there doing traditional method punch down in our whole cluster Pinot Noir. You can see the stems in the fermenter. That's later in the fermentation as we're just trying to get the last little bit of squeeze out of the grapes. And there on the right side of your screen, you can see that awesome dark color that you get. What you can't get from the picture, and if you have a bottle of wine with you right now, I would invite you to open it and pour a little bit in your glass. And I'm going to lead us through a tasting later in the presentation, but let's give it some air. What you can't tell is just the abundant fruit aroma. And a whole cluster, you know, I love this wine because it is truly the pure fruit expression of the Pinot Noir grape. Because it's an early released wine, you know, the aroma compounds are the most fleeting. So being able to bottle this wine early in its life and release it to our customers captures all that fruit aroma. And then once you pour that glass, that's the very first thing that hits you. And I really think it's one of the things people really enjoy about the wine. Not only that, but it's got this really silky, velvety texture to it. And it's one of those things that people really come to appreciate for the wines. I get a lot of questions about how the 2020 growing season was. I know if you were watching the news during harvest season, you heard of the wildfires, most notably the Beachy Creek fire, which affected some of the forests just east of the winery. And one of the things that we have going for us is the location of our estate vineyards. I took some pictures and I wanted to talk a little bit about it by illustrating against the location of our estate vineyard properties. You know, one of the things that I always like to remind people is the Willamette Valley is huge. And the varying conditions of smoke that we experienced really allowed us to play it to our advantage. So top left picture, these are all taken on the same day, mind you. It was September 10th. Top left picture is our estate vineyard, and that was the closest to the Beachy Creek fire. Top right is our new vineyard. We've named it after Jim Bernau. It's called Bernau Estate, and that's top right there. Left is our Elton Vineyard, which is in the Yola Amity Hills, and you can see the smoke almost splitting that screen. And then to the very right, that's our Tualatin Estate Vineyard. That's as far north as Portland, but west as you head towards the coastal range. So you can see this varying degree of smoke influence that these vineyards experienced. And what we did was we played that to our advantage. And you're going to hear some people that chose not to make wine in 2020. And really that was their choice and their comfort level. But for us, we were quite comfortable. And I think by tasting this wine, you would agree that we produced a pretty awesome wine from an awesome vintage. The growing season itself started off with really pleasant weather, except when we hit June, which is when the grapevines get pollinated, we experienced a pretty gloomy June, and it was cold and it was raining, and that did not bode well for the pollination of the grapes. So what happened was we ended up having really historically low yields. And we haven't seen yields like this since the 2020 vintage. But as a winemaker, I know that less tends to mean more when we're talking about grapes. So the concentration, the tannic profile, the color, the mouthfeel components that the vintage was setting up for was just outstanding. And I wasn't going to let anything stop this vintage from coming to fruition. So just wanted to share a little bit of the varying conditions that we experienced and how we were able to use that to our advantage.
Joe, I think that one of the things you mentioned is that the yields were low, a lot like the highly regarded 2012 vintage. And you said 2020 there, and that was just to clarify that they were similar to 2012.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. 2012 was historically low as well, and 2020 was pretty much on par with that.
Right.
Thanks.
That was just to let everyone know that. Well, one of the other things that really happened during this year is that, during the wildfires and smoke in the valley, there were many wineries for a number of reasons, like Joe mentioned, that, maybe it was a lack of experience working with grapes that have been exposed to smoke. But for one reason and another, there were many growers and many contracts that were walked away from or canceled. And, because of our low yields from our estate vineyards, being 38% down on average, we saw that there was an opportunity to help. And because we've had experience working with grapes that have been in smoke conditions, like the experience we had back in 2018 working with our Oregon Solidarity Partnership, where we went down to the Rogue Valley during a time where contracts were canceled from the producer of the wine Elawan, we were able to pick up and make the wine together, and through that really learn from that experience. And so we had a little bit of comfort and understanding of the right protocols to do. And so we actually put a call out to the industry this past harvest as well, doing the same thing. And we were able to purchase from 22 growers at the last minute after running their grapes through micro-fermentations to assess that the quality of the wine was clean and we could make high quality wines out of this. And so you'll actually see with our whole cluster this year, the sourcing is from some of the highest quality vineyards in the Willamette Valley, in addition to some of our estates. vineyards like Zenith that are, contribute to a lot of single vineyard designates for a lot of wineries are now components of that in our whole cluster this year. And when we total that amount, it was a very significant amount. 22 growers equaled just over $1.2 million. And so we feel very, very fortunate as a winery to have been in a position of, strength and experience, but also, financial stability to be able to have helped these growers during this time. And that's, is one of the reasons why we were able to make whole cluster in the amount that we're accustomed to is through these partnerships. And Joe did a lot of coordination to harvest and work with all these growers in the last minute, as that was not in the plan. But when fruit comes available as good as this did, we just couldn't turn it away. And the micro-fermentations that he did to assess the quality was really our key factor in deciding if the grapes were safe enough to enter the cellars. We weren't going to bring in anything that could compromise our quality as well. I do see a few questions coming in, and right before we go to DJ, I just thought this might be a good time to ask Joe, because these really do kind of go back to the winemaking style. So Joe, question from Glenn is, how does the yeast get inside the berry to ferment? When you talk about the fermentation starting internally, can you clarify that at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I'll talk about the traditional way to do carbonic maceration, and that is where you pick perfect clusters of Pinot Noir. They can't be compromised at all. They can't have rot or anything like that. So they got to be perfectly grown and cared for and harvested. They come into the winery. What we do is we gently take those clusters and then we put them into a stainless steel tank. We fill it all the way up to the top. And just by the gravity alone, you're starting to split open some of the berries, but you got to imagine that that is the most gentle kind of pressing that you can do. It's just gravity of the clusters on top of each other. And what happens is what we do is we sprinkle the yeast on top and we close the top. But before we do that, we add a little bit of dry ice. Dry ice is just solidified carbon dioxide. And the reason why we do that is just to protect the grapes until the yeast can produce enough carbon dioxide on their own. Then we close the tank and we come back, can be later that day or it can be the next day. And we go to the bottom valve and we look at the juice, because the juice has been liberated from some of those berries at the bottom. And what we do is we do a very gentle percolation at the very beginning, and that gets the yeast down into the rest of the tank. So if you can just picture them kind of percolating down. But, you know, the magic of grapes and fungus, which is a yeast, is that the grapes are these perfect, mineral-rich, sweet balls of joy for yeast, and they find their way into the berries themselves, and then they conduct the fermentation within the berry. And then, you know, Jim talked about it. If you went in and grabbed one of those berries and you bit it, it would pop in your mouth, and it's got this fizzy quality to it, and it tastes like, you know, this, you know, transition between sugar and wine, and it's really just a really delightful experience.
That's great. I guess we actually shouldn't have withheld tasting the wine and having you lead that first, but I really wanted to get to that question so that people could understand it just while you were talking about the style.
Yeah, we use the term carbonic maceration. And if you think about those two words, it's carbon, meaning carbon dioxide, and maceration, which means, you know, tearing apart. And some of those berries actually, through the carbon dioxide in the berry, will pop. And that's kind of the essence of carbonic maceration.
Well, now might be a good time for you to lead a tasting of what you're getting out of the wine now and how you expect that to unfold. Yeah,
I've poured my glass already, and one of the very first things I want to draw everybody's attention to is the color. I mean, you can't miss it. It's got this amazing dark, rich color. But then go ahead and put your nose in the glass. And I always like to start from a distance and work my way in. I like to move my nose across the face of the glass and try to capture all those fruit aromas. And as I mentioned, the beauty of Whole Cluster being an early released wine is that you're capturing all those fleeting fruit aromas which want to oxidize and leave. But we've captured that early in its life. We put it in a bottle, and then there it is. It's truly the pure fruit expression of the Pinot Noir grape. But the season was a very concentrated season. So we got things like ripe seeds, which we don't always get in Oregon. It was a warm vintage, low yielding, and much of the tannins that you get from a wine are from the seeds, the grape seeds themselves. So we got some nuttiness, some spiciness, layers of it beneath the fruit. And then Pinot Noir has got these amazing aromas of earth and mushroom. And then as it ages, you'll get these secondary notes. We call them things you might know as cedar box or tobacco. It's just this beautiful combination of aromas, fruit aromas and spice aromas.
Just so juicy and so rich this year.
Very jammy. I like to think
I
of.
feel bad that we forgot to pour DJ a glass down there. I know he's going to serve his dinner later. Oh, there he goes. I was like, did we forget to share with him?
It reminds me of like a berry cobbler, like a cherry or berry cobbler. And it's just got this silky, velvety mouthfeel to it, which is really easy for people to understand. And
I mean, as you're talking, DJ, do you have, the food pairings that you would pair with this? What are some of your tips? And, what should we be enjoying with this wine?
Well, thanks, Christine. I would really like to spotlight how versatile our Whole Cluster Pinot Noir is by showcasing several different dishes and how they pair with our Pinot Noir. When you have a glass, like Joe was saying earlier, you get those beautiful aromas of blackberry, cherry, and raspberry, accented by subtle notes of savory spices and vanilla. The wine hits the palate with the really rich and velvety notes of big, juicy flavors, followed by aromas of dark chocolate and mocha. And with the winemaking process that focuses on pure fruit expression, we suggested on hot summer days especially, that you cellar your wines before opening. By cellaring your Pinot, that bright raspberry and jammy blackberry notes get really enhanced the food that you're willing to pair it with. And I would suggest pairings such as spicy Asian food or Indian dishes, where the soy and the sesame will balance with that fruit forwardness and opens the palate to the subtle flavors of baking spices and toasted hazelnuts. And as we're getting into closer to summer, barbecuing on the grill is on everyone's mind. So that sweet, tangy barbecue sauce is great for pairing with our Whole Cluster Pinot Noir. Another summer dish that pairs really well is grilled flatbreads loaded with your favorite toppings. The wine's fruit forward and subtle tannins allow for it to be used with a multitude of flavor profiles. And here in the Northwest, one of my favorite pairings is a grilled plank salmon. We've got the earthiness from the fresh herbs, mushrooms, and the cedar really mirrors the chocolate and mocha notes, as well as balancing with the soft, velvety texture of the wine. It's such a great pairing that I want to share it with you guys at home. So I've actually prepared a recipe of wild mushroom and herb crusted plank salmon that we're going to mail out to you guys for this week. Those are my biggest notes on that one. So back to you, Christine.
Of course, the biggest blunder of Zoom, right, is having to unmute yourself. Thanks, DJ. We will certainly get that email out to everyone. That's wonderful to share, and so that people can recreate the dish and enjoy with the Whole Cluster at home. Also, if people were kind of wondering why DJ has this beautiful salmon just down there in the library, he's actually gearing up to serve a pairings dinner tonight. And if you've been here at the winery, you know how wonderful his food and wine pairings are. And each month he hosts 4-course meals with our wines, and so he has one tonight. So we're pretty lucky to get him out of the kitchen for this little bit of time to join us today. So we did have quite a few questions come in, and so I'll go to those now. I think one that would be good to ask Jim, put him on the hot spot a little bit, is how does the quantity of the resveratrol in your testing, in your partnership with the science, in the Whole Cluster compare to the other Pinot Noirs you make? Would they be different?
Yes, that's a great question. We actually did test at one time for a number of years all of our Pinot Noirs. It's quite expensive to do. And every year, time and time again, the whole cluster fermented Pinot Noir is the one that far outdistanced the other Pinot Noirs. And we really think it has to do with that really how the wine is made. When you make a traditional Pinot Noir, you're crushing the berries, you're fermenting in generally an open top fermenter. You're introducing a lot of oxygen right into the fermenter. And as a consequence, resveratrol is effective because it goes after the free radicals in your bloodstream, which are nicking up the cardiovascular system, causing platelets to form, clotting to form. And what a free radical, what these resveratrol does is they go and attach themselves to the oxygen molecule in a free radical. So that's the thing. You open up a bottle of whole cluster Pinot Noir, you got about an hour because that resveratrol is going to go to work finding oxygen molecules to attach itself to. So when you ferment the way we do, where the fermentation is taking place inside the skins of the berry, there's less interaction with oxygen in the environment, and that's why we think we're getting more resveratrol in the whole cluster fermented Pinot Noir. In fact, our particular whole cluster Pinot Noir tested out as the highest any wine tested by Cornell University in doing their studies about which grape variety performed the best for resveratrol content. Now, I want to add that we're not making any health claims here. The reason why we did this was frankly just to poke the federal government in the eye when they told all wineries that they couldn't say anything nice about wine on a label. And you might remember that the federal government required Robert Mondavi to recall all of his wine and remove all of his labels in one vintage because he had on his back label that wine was part of a healthy lifestyle. And so when we found out that we had the science and we proved to the federal government we had the science, they went ahead and let us put it on the label.
That's incredible. I guess everyone's getting a little bit of a dose what it's like to work with Jim too on a daily basis, poking eyes and proving people wrong. So, well, that's a great lead into one of the things that people are asking. I love this, George. George Joe, it might be one of your biggest fans because here's his question: how is the rosé made ? Into perfection? So clearly a whole cluster of rosé of Pinot Noir fan here. And so they're asking, is it the extra juice from the Pinot Noir or is it 100% on its own? Maybe you can take him through how we came to make our whole cluster rosé back in 2015 and how it's really improved the wine over time.
Yeah, thank you for the nice compliments on the wine. Originally, whole cluster rosé started as what we call Saunier, or the free run juice, from that gentle gravity pressing that I was talking about when we made our whole cluster. It was kind of like a win-win because I was able to pull off this beautiful lightly colored pink juice that didn't have, the skins were still intact, so it didn't bleed a lot of color into the juice. I was able to take some of that juice away into another vessel, ferment it cold, and rosé was essentially born. But at the same time, I was getting some concentration on the whole cluster fermentation as well by increasing the skin to juice ratio. And that's the way it continued. What happens is we load these tanks with whole clusters, and then we go through and we open the bottom valve and we look at the quality and the color of the juice. If it's suitable for whole cluster rosé, we pull it off and we ferment it cold. And it's really awesome. I talked about the pure fruit expression of Pinot Noir in our whole cluster Pinot Noir. Well, then here's a whole nother fruit expression through the rosé where instead of getting this berry cobbler, cherry aromas, now you're getting watermelon, raspberry, cranberry, pomegranate in the rosé. And then, on every given vintage, I'll do a portion of it as whole cluster pressed. I that a little bit more this year, given the conditions that we had to work with. So typically, it's mostly free run juice, but this year we utilize some whole cluster pressing as well.
And that, Joe, maybe just to explain, that whole cluster pressing is you wanted to quickly get the wine off its skins because maybe those were areas that had been exposed to smoke, so you're just playing it really safe.
Yeah, that's right. You know, we've learned that through whole cluster pressing, you can get a 5 times reduction in any type of smoke compounds that could be affecting the grapes. So, you know, the rosé turned out beautiful, and I'm really excited about it.
Okay, another question we have from Peter. Peter wants to know, when we talked about yeast, when we were talked about sprinkling some yeast into a whole cluster tank before fermentation started, you know, can you talk about how you select your yeast strains, and do you use different strains for different styles of your wine?
Yeah, this one is easy, and usually I don't like to show my cards and some of the proprietary stuff I do, but we have our own proprietary yeast that we use here at Willamette Valley Vineyards. It's something that we've kept the genetics on hand at the yeast supplier, so you can't copy it anyway. It's something that keeps our consistent style, and it's a very strong fermenter. My favorite kind of yeast is one that completes the fermentation, and that one has no trouble doing it. So, yeah.
Then we have Mark. Mark's asking, how does the 2019 compare to the 2020? Because one thing we have heard for people joining us today is that 2019 is sometimes the vintage that's still readily available and present in their stores. Here at the winery, we're just transitioning to 2020, and in our tasting rooms, in our distributorships, that's the wine that will start to be shipped from here. But can you talk a little bit about how the vintages compared?
Yeah, the vintages were pretty different. 2019, we had really pleasant weather throughout the entirety of the harvest. We had a little bit of rain during the harvest season, and we had average yields. And the biggest difference you're going to find in the wines is that in 2020, as I mentioned, we had riper seeds. So you've got a lot of that kind of nutty, spicy, a little bit more tannic quality in the wines. You're still going to have the same color, same abundant fruit aroma. I think you're going to find that 2020 is a little bit more structured. That was just the unavoidable effect of low yields and good plentiful sunshine and warmish vintage. So I would say 2020, a little bit more bold, a little bit more robust, a little bit more structured with this underlying spice and nutty component to it. But 2019, beautiful wine, same rich color, concentrated velvety texture to it, just so maybe a little bit more softer earlier in its life.
And then I think the question a lot of people have asked is, you know, since Whole Cluster is such an early release, what do you think about its age worthiness and its longevity if they were to cellar the wine?
Did you know what I had planned? Because I thought it'd be fun to pull out a library wine. This is a 2012 Whole Cluster Pinot Noir.
Of course you did.
DJ, you want to come taste it with me?
Right over there. You're right there, Joe.
DJ's in the next room.
Man, I haven't seen that label in actually quite a long time.
This is the label that was on the bottles for a long time. And the one when I started here, this is what we had.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think we did the update starting with the 2015 vintage. So right when you came, we were selling that wine. And so it just kind of is a throwback if you think of it.
One of the things that, you know, I didn't want to go through this presentation without pointing it out is take a look at your cork. You'll see 2 emblems on it, FSC certified plus Rainforest Alliance certified. 2 certifying agencies that we were the very first winery to utilize cork from these 2 certifying agencies. And really what that says is I support the production of sustainable corks, which is extremely important for the environment. We want to keep these cork trees in the ground. They are responsible for, I think the latest estimate I read was 31 million tons of greenhouse gas is sequestered from the cork oak forest in the Mediterranean basin. So by choosing a quality cork product, you're keeping those people sustainably producing cork. And we've been a big believer of it since day one. So
just to add in there that recently there was a study done by the drinks business that said just choosing natural cork lowers a wine's carbon footprint by 25%. So for making, decisions about, helping save the planet, you can do so just in the selection of natural cork for your choice closure on wines. Okay, I got to know what this tasting is.
Show everybody the color.
Color on that is beautiful. It is a nice deep purple. It's got still some reddish colors to it on those legs. It is gorgeous. And the smell on this, Joe, this actually reminds me of a good pairings with a good beef sirloin. I've got a pomegranate and beef sirloin recipe, or a beef short rib actually would be perfect with this.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. I'd also have to say thank you guys too. We're finally be able to get our second vaccination, so we're able to enjoy wine again together.
It is so exciting. We're all excited about this. Well, I certainly want to know, Joe, from your perspective, how the wine, like how is it that whole cluster can age? Because if you're releasing it so early, what is it that makes it so we can still see color like that?
So people ask me this all the time, what makes a wine ageable? And it comes to a lot of things. It has to be first produced by a quality producer. They got to respect the wine through its entire life process. So don't pump it around a lot. We don't use pumps, and we use very gentle pumps. The wine chemistry has to be right. You have to have great acidity in the wines. You got to have tannins. Tannins are an antioxidant. They protect the wine. And then you got to package it properly. You got to be mindful of the amount of oxygen. You have to have a quality closure to protect the wine over its life. And if you take care of those things, you're guaranteed to have a nice ageable wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that Jim's always encouraged us to, when we're talking to people about whole cluster, he's always telling me, make sure you send them with a case out of the tasting room. They need to taste that wine next year and the year after and see how it's evolving. Because it is so wonderful to kind of watch a wine through its life cycle like that. And, I wouldn't have expected 2012. I knew it was great vintage, but I wouldn't have expected it to be so plush and so vibrant still. So that's really exciting to see and encouraging for all of us that do have some whole clusters that are, 5, 7, 10 years old to dig out of the cellar soon. We do have a couple questions just to make sure that we're answering these here. So we have a question from David about, are the whole cluster Pinot Noir and the Rosé released at the same time? And I can take that. Typically, David, here in the cellar, the whole cluster Rosé and the Pinot Noir are both spring releases by intention. Since these are stainless steel fermented and don't really need barrel aging time to soften and develop, they're ready to release right away. And so they tend to be the first on the bottling line. We're bottling the Rosé today. So these are wines that you'll see in the market around the same time each year. We had a question from Keenan come in about, where does the cork come from? So the cork, this is 100% natural cork that is harvested from the bark of a cork tree. And you actually harvest the bark every 7 to 9 years. And when you do so, it does not kill the tree. Therefore, cork is a renewable resource. And when you ask where it comes from, our corks are grown in Portugal, leading producer of corks. And that's where they also do the manufacturing and the quality control for the corks before they arrive here. So a little bit about it. I know that Jim's got to visit the cork forest in Portugal, and it sounds just like one of those trips of a lifetime. I really want to do that at some point, because they're home to a lot of endangered species as well. So it's a very, very important part of our ecosystem. And then we have Carol Ann and Gary. They've asked, what does it mean when Joe says more structured? So Joe, can you kind of take away your winemaker jargon and tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, sorry, I talk like a winemaker too often, I forget. When I talk about a wine being structured, it can refer to the fullness of the sensation you have in your mouth when you're having a sip. So a wine that is not structured will taste kind of thin, almost watery. A wine that is structured has a full mouthfeel. It coats your mouth. It feels, sometimes people can say, you know, it's a little bit more chewy or has some viscosity to it. And that's really an effect of the vintage, the tannins that came out in fermentation. And that really helps describe the wine in terms of mouth richness.
Thank you. We also have a question from Louise here about, would we try to release a whole cluster nouveau in November? And here's what I'll say to that. Are you trying to kill us? Essentially, here in Oregon, we are still harvesting in November. So we can't imagine fermenting it and getting to bottle as quick as the Beaujolais with their purely carbonic process. Essentially, since ours is a whole cluster and whole berry fermentation, we do take the wine through those fermentations. We then do our winemaking, blending, and bottling. So soon after the first of the year. But I really think that myself being like a pretty intense type A, high stress individual, I can't imagine doing a nouveau release. It also is a little different style since it's not purely carbonic. So I guess we're not going to celebrate in November in time for Thanksgiving, but we'll certainly do it each spring as part of the release. So I guess with all that, we loved answering all your questions and having you all join us for this release of Whole Cluster and explanation of how in 2020, though there was smoke in the skies in some parts of the valley, not all was lost. In fact, so much good came of the year. These wines are really going to be beautiful and age-worthy. And one of the things we feel so fortunate here at Willamette Valley Vineyards is that we have our estate vineyards located across the valley so that we were able to make this wine, support our teammates and our employees here, and also our distributors, our owners, our customers, so that we didn't have to skip a vintage, because that would have been very, very hard to go through. And we definitely know we have wineries in our valley, but also down in California, that have had to make those choices. And we're just very, very lucky that that wasn't the case for us, and that these 2020 wines are really something to celebrate and enjoy. So thank you all. I want to toast to you for joining us and your support of our Whole Cluster Pinot Noir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Salute and cheers, guys.
Thank you all.